Everyone here, and thank you so much for making the time to join us for our Tapping into Elul series. Just for me, it's very meaningful to see everyone, hopefully for you as well, just to connect with one another. And tonight promises to be a fascinating evening. Josh and Professor Saiman, should I just say a line to get it started? What do you say?
Kick it off.
Sure. Okay. All right, so hold on. Okay, just telling my boys to be a little quiet while we get the program started. All right, great crowd. So nice to see all of you. Good evening. We're so honored to be hosting Professor Chaim Saiman, who's a brilliant scholar and author. And so excited that Professor Saiman has joined us this evening live from the East Coast at the late hour, exclusive for Bet Jacob community, and that he'll be joined in conversation with our scholar and leader in Bet Jacob, Josh Katzen. So I'm going to turn it right over to Josh to take it away.
Great. All right. Fantastic. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited tonight for this conversation with Professor Chaim Saiman, who is, as Rabbi Top said, a fantastic scholar and I know personally just a fantastic person. He is a professor at the law school at Villanova University, and he's a scholar of American law and also of Jewish law. And so he has just a broad background that he can integrate, and it just makes him a very fascinating person to learn from. I'm going to put a plug. Chaim did not ask me to do this, but I am going to plug this book, which I think it's called Halacha, the Rabbinic Idea of Law. It is truly a beautiful book. So if you haven't read it yet, I highly, highly recommend it. So very quickly, and then we'll get to Chaim, I just want to give a roadmap of what we're going to do tonight. So the first thing is we'll talk a little bit about the main argument and some of the key points of the book, just to introduce people to the thought. And then we'll transition from there into some more contemporary halachic issues. But before we do all that, we're going to play a little bit of Jewish geography. So I hope that you'll indulge us, because it's actually amazing. So this is, not everyone knows this, but Chaim is from Atlanta. Malka, my wife, is from Atlanta. Chaim's mom taught Malka in first grade, and their families go back even further. So Chaim, please, welcome. Give us the background of kind of where you're from and the long-standing relationship between our families.
Sure. So as Josh mentioned, I grew up and was born in Atlanta, Georgia in the mid 70s, which was then a very, very small frum community. My parents are both Israeli and wound up there, and were about 10 to 15 years younger than the people who founded that shul, also called Beth Jacob. Amongst them, Malka Rabinowitz's grandparents, Ben and Sonia. So I grew up sort of around them because those were my parents' friends, even though they were somewhat older. And I was, of course, like the kind of grandkid in training. I'm a drop older than Malka, who I believe is the oldest of the grandchildren there. And they really treated me that way. And her grandfather was a large and outsized presence and personality. He was a Kohen with a deep baritone voice that we always called the Kohen Gadol, and was really a part of my life when I was, a young child from 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then Josh and my wife Sherry went to college together, and then we reconnected with Josh and Malka when we were both in Cambridge. So this goes back a while.
Right. So it's amazing, because I guess it's a good example of we're doing this all by Zoom, but at the end of the day, we know each other, and Malka's family and all that, really just because of community. We have been in the same communities in various places. So hopefully sometime soon we'll all get back to that, of kind of bumping into people in the shul and the kiddush again, and getting to develop those relationships that are a little harder during this period. So, okay, now let's get... Beautiful. So great. So let's now let's get to the meat a little bit. So
more of the herring, but
herring on me next time we're all in the same place. So the book, like I said, really tremendous, thoughtful book. And so just to introduce it to people a little bit, so for the title alone, Halakha, the Rabbinic Idea of Law, there's an implication that there's something special about Halakha, there's something special about the Rabbinic Idea of Law that makes it somehow different. And one of the key distinctions that you make in the book is between Halakha as regulation, as you would say, which is something I would paraphrase as maybe something more like, what's the halacha? What am I supposed to do in this situation? Okay, so halacha is regulation. As opposed to something a little broader, which is what you call halacha as Torah. And that is halacha as a body of teachings through which the rabbis get across sometimes more abstract concepts, but in the language of legalese. Okay, so that's a lot to unpack. So with that, Chaim, why don't you just start from the beginning? When did you start thinking about these issues, and then maybe give us a sense of what is that distinction and why is it important?
Sure, thanks. So there's a, I started talking about this a long time ago in different ways, but I thought I might read maybe a paragraph or two, maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs from the preface to the book, which explains one way towards this. So, and this is really the very, very beginning. There's a preface and an introduction. So I write, in many ways, the original idea from this book took root in 1990 as a 10th grader in the high school division of Ner Yisrael in Baltimore. I became immersed in the world of Talmud study and exposed to the idea that a 15-year-old boy should spend at least 10 hours a day engaged in the intricate details of legal analysis. In the all-encompassing environment of the yeshiva, Sundays are no different than Tuesdays. Free weekends are rare, and there are few opportunities to venture off campus and emerge from its controlled habitat. For if the yeshiva's primary message was a centrality and constant study of Talmud, an exercise so sacrosanct to be dubbed Talmud Torah, a close second was the ever-looming danger presented by television, movies, music, and other forms of pop culture, all inevitably suffused with the imagery of romance and sexual attraction. Such things are never far from the mind of a teenage boy, but were seldom spoken in public. Instead, the guiding mantra was to follow the Talmud's advice: if you encounter this lecherous inclination, pull him into the Beit Midrash. This set the backdrop for one of the most defining and bewildering moments of my life. At the time, our 10th grade class was studying the first chapter of Tractate Kiddushin, which deals with the legal mechanics of how a man betroths a woman. The Talmudic discussion here has little practical relevance for today's teenagers, or really anyone outside of a few specialists in the field. Nor is the text in question an obvious choice for a yeshiva that strives, with more success than generally assumed, to keep its students oriented towards an austere set of religious pursuits, rather than what typically occupies the minds of American high schoolers. Imagine my surprise then, as the lesson proceeded to the following. The Mishnah rules that a woman may become engaged to a man by either accepting money from him or by means of a formalized document, or via sexual union. The Talmud, being the Talmud, however, pushes for greater specificity, which leads to the following discussion. They asked, does the beginning of the sexual act affect betrothal, or is it the conclusion of the act that affects betrothal? What is the practical difference? Where the male has only initiated the sexual act, but the woman has stretched out her hand in the meantime and accepted betrothal from another, what is the law? A Maimar said in the name of Rava, one who engages in the sexual act does so with the intention of completing it. So this is me in 10th grade, introduced to this whole new world of a yeshiva environment. I grew up Orthodox, but not in any sense yeshivish. And on the one hand, what you're being told is stay focused on the Gemara, on the law, on things like that, and all these other issues that so attract and so interest a high school child are off limits. And then when it comes to the Torah itself, here we are like describing something that is like so hard to understand. Like, wait, a woman is with one person and at that moment stretches her arm to accept an engagement proposal from someone else. Like, what am I supposed to think of this? And this troubled me. I just didn't understand what I was being asked to do, what I was being asked to think about, how this all fit together. And it didn't seem to trouble my classmates. And that bothered me. And I would say that's kind of one way into this. It's just, what are we doing here? This thing that we call Talmud Torah, which we're so used to, that a scene like this, I can phrase it in a way that will make everyone laugh, but like, we all know what's happening. Now, this is extreme, but, think about, your fourth grade class. Today here we started in Philadelphia school. I think you can make a shachiyanu on that, but the rabbi will tell us later whether he thinks that's okay. So the fourth graders are going to learn, Bava Metzia, and invariably going to learn the Mishnah about the four Shomrim. Now, I ask you, if you look at fourth grade curriculums the world over, I'm quite certain that the law of bailments, which is the legal terminology for Shomrim, does not appear on any fourth grade curriculum anywhere else. And even if it does the law of bailments for a system written 2,000 years ago that we don't exactly use in that way at this moment. Now, viewed this way, all these practices make no sense, right? No other legal system thinks of its law this way, and no other religion really thinks of its law this way. And it's really these sets of issues, whether we think about it, as a 15-year-old kid, or being a parent of children now who are, a little bit younger than that, but sort of going through the day school system. And I didn't have a good answer for this. And what bothered me as a 15-year-old continued to bother me as an adult, which is nobody really talks about this in this way. No one puts it on the table. Like, what are we doing here? So that's one half of it. The other half is I teach in a law school, as you mentioned. And in a law school, we are constantly taught to think of the law in the context of a state, or at the very least, in the context of the society that law governs. That's basically what we do. Now, surely this is part of what halakha is about, but it's only part, because what that account leaves out is what I would call the drama of learning, the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and the audacious view that Chazal have that the study of the law is, in some sense, a fulfillment, perhaps even the highest fulfillment, or at the very least, a central component. And again, that's not something that has a parallel in any other legal system, for sure. No state makes that claim about its law. I teach insurance law. I'm considered a scholar in insurance law. But there's no sense that everyone on this call needs to be holding an insurance law to be a good American. There's certainly no sense that the teaching of insurance law or contract law, there are many ways to describe it. It could be interesting, it could be useful, it could be lucrative. But if I walk into my law school class and I tell them we're going to do something holy, spiritual, connect to God, they'll look at me like I'm insane. And yet I can come home and learn with my chavrusa material that is very, very similar. And yet that change in context totally changes what we're doing. And all these features got me to think that law is a necessary word here. I think it's silly to run away from it, but it's clearly not capturing a lot, and to me, to some degree, the most interesting parts of what it is that we as individuals and we collectively are doing when we talk about Torah and when we talk about halacha.
So to build on that, it's funny that you brought up the concept of learning Bava Metzia with with young children. So I was just thinking of this. So my son Leo and I are learning Mishnayot and Bava Metzia. Okay, so it's a perfect example. So we're sitting there, and clearly we're not learning these for it to be something that he puts into practice, maybe ever, certainly not anytime soon. And yet there's so much that we get out of it, which comes out of the text, right? And so when you think about the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, there's one way of thinking about it, which is we are supposed to learn Torah. But I think in the book, what you draw out, which in a very beautiful way, is that there are so many things that we learn that are written in the language of law, but have such deep meaning in them that regardless of when you're living, these are things that there are important lessons to take away from them. So if you don't mind, maybe that's something worth expanding on.
Sure. So you're right that is, as I kind of try to come up with an answer, at least a perspective on like what is going on here, precisely because the answer is well, these are the rules and we need to know them, doesn't fully answer the mail, both in terms of what we learn and, as you mentioned, how we learn. If that were the goal, then you wouldn't learn Bava Metzia with your son. You'd pull out, the Hilchas Shabbos that's appropriate for that age, the Shmir Shabbos Kehilchasa, or the Mishnah Berurah, or maybe even the Mishnayos and Shabbos or whatnot, and you'd say, look, here's how we celebrate Shabbos. We also do that, right? But we don't only do that, and more than that, certainly the influence of the yeshiva system of the last 200 years is that the highest form of learning is typically not that. So that begs the question is then what are we doing? And what I've come to sense, and here the influence of Mori Rabbi Rav Lichtenstein is very strong in the tradition that he comes from, is that there's more going on here, right? That the process of learning is itself very important. And then, okay, what are we getting out of it? What are we getting out of it? Now, as you said, my thesis is that because the law and the halacha looms so large, it then does the work that in our, let's say, American system, we would assign to other media, like literature, like poetry, like philosophy, maybe even like art, right? All sorts of ways that a society communicates meaning and values and its sort of sense of self to itself. Very interestingly, right, is that from Chazal, we don't have those things, right? There's no visual arts. There's no separate literature. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit. Right, it's all sort of what's in the sort of four quarters of the Gemara, so to speak. And therefore, that does a lot of work. So let's take a couple examples. Let's take maybe the most simple example. We know that there are 39 melachos of Shabbos, right? Now you could say, listen, I don't know how to sew. I don't flay skins, right? If you look at most of those melachos in our day and age, we don't do many of them on Tuesday, much less on Shabbos. So as a practice matter, you're like, well, okay, sure, right? So we probably write, although today we're now writing, maybe not even writing so much anymore. And, you'll turn on your car, and you'll cook. Okay, those are things. But then you say, okay, if you just look at that list of 39 melachos, the Gemara and the Rishonim point out already, it divides into three categories. The famous one is Sidur de Pat, so the process to make bread, from planting to baking. And then there's what the Rishonim call Sidur de Beged, right, which is the process of making clothes, from shearing wool to weaving, to dyeing, etc. And then the last one is generally thought of as things having to do with building. Now, you then think back to your 6th grade social studies class, and they asked you, and you were taught that the three foundations of human society are food, shelter, and clothing, right? And that in order to have the bare minimum of what we think a human society is, you have to master that. So now once you think about that, it's interesting that the Mishnah's kind of 39 melachos basically break down into those things. So what it's telling you is exactly that which makes and enables society possible 6 days a week is exactly what you don't do on Shabbos. Now, once I've learned that, me not sewing and the fact that I don't sew on Shabbos, that becomes less important. Because in understanding how that halacha fits within a certain structure, it's communicating something about the nature of Shabbos and my attitude towards it, right? So leaving aside like how we apply these things to labors we do today, electricity, we can talk about that. But just at the level of like what we're doing, so this I want to take as a very, very simple example, almost like not even an example, just something that I think people already know, that by learning the Mishnah, by looking at its structure, by then thinking deeply about what these categories are and represent, we right there have brought meaning outside of whether I happen to sow or flay a deer or trap a deer or harvest grain any day of the week, especially on Shabbos. Let me take another example. It's the sort of one this one's not in the book. It's the one I sort of start in the book because it's very dramatic, and it's very obvious, what, to me at least, what's happening here. So it's just 2 weeks ago we read Parshas Shoftim, and in the very end, this is a week before that. You have the Egla Rufa. So the Egla Rufa is a ceremony that is performed when there's a murder. Velo noda mihikahu. You don't know who murdered the person. So someone is found, seems to be like out in the field, like not in the city, in a little bit no man's land. And velo noda mihikahu, you don't know who killed this person. Like the CSI Torah, right? So what do you do? So the psukim in Sefer Dvarim explain that v'yasu zakenecha v'shoftecha, the sort of elders of the community and the judges, are supposed to go out to where this body is, and they're supposed to measure from the body to the nearest town. And then the town that's the nearest town has to bring, it's not exactly a korban, but I would say a korban-like sort of activity where they hack the back of a neck of a calf by a dry riverbed, and they literally wash their hands from the blood, saying, we're not responsible. That's where that phrase, wash your hands of the blood, come from. Okay, that's in the Torah. Now, the Mishnah in the last chapter of Sota, which is where this is discussed, becomes very interested in the question of measuring from the body. And the Mishnah says as follows. It records a kind of a dual machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Lazar. And it says, Nimtza rosh b'makom achad, v'guf b'makom acher. So what if the head is severed completely from the body? So the head is in one side and the body is in another corner. So Rabbi Akiva says you drag the body to the head and you measure from there. And Rabbi Lazar says, no, you pick up the head and bring it to the body. And then the Mishnah goes one step further. It says, Meheichan hayu modudin. Where would they measure from? Meaning, so Rabbi Akiva says, Michotmo, from his nose. And Rabbi Lazar says, Mitiburo, from his navel. Now, I want to think about this for a second, as a law for a second. So again, if we were to classify this as halacha, this would be halacha. It's not a Agadic, right? It's Paskin in the Rambam. It's a Mishnah, right? So in any sort of categorization where we try to, you could typically divide what's in the Gemara into two categories, either halacha or Agadic. Okay, this would be tagged as halacha. But think about it, now I won't use the word halacha, to be law, right? To be something that happens in the world, you have to assume that we have this body found perfectly equidistant from two towns, right, from LA and San Diego, such that if we measure from the nose, we're going to get LA, and if we measure from the navel, we'll get San Diego. Now, I'm not saying this can't happen, but this seems highly improbable. I would note the Mishnah does not say where in the town you measure to, which that seems to be really important if we're down to the tenth of an inch here. Mishnah doesn't talk about that. So you could say, okay, well, but if it would happen, what's halacha? And my answer, sure. But now the Gemara here says something very interesting. The Gemara says, "B'mai kamiflagi." What are they arguing about? And it says as follows: Mar savar ikar chiyute ba'ape. Rabbi Akiva says that, we'll translate the words literally first. The primary life force is in the nose. Ikar chiyute. And Rabbi Lazar says, ikar chiyute b'tibure. The primary life force is in his navel. Now that's not a whole, that's not super clear what that means. We could talk about that. But clearly, what the Gemara has done, which is what the Gemara often does, is that the Mishnah makes it sound like we're talking about an inch or two of space. And the Gemara says, no, we're talking about an idea here, right? That behind the Mishnah's tactile ruling is a sort of conceptual debate about the primary life force. Now, if you look, right, this is connected to several other sugya, but Rebbe Loz's explanation is, in the Yerushalmi, it says, Mimakam shehavlad notzar, that the belly button is where the sort of human form is created from. Whereas for Rabbi Akiva, they cite, well, what pasuk do you think is explained, Rabbi Akiva? Vayipach b'apo ruach hayim, that God blows breath into Adam's nostrils, and that's how he becomes an animated form. Now, my view on this is asking a question that every society is going to ask in its own way, which is, these humans, anatomically, biochemically, those are the words we would use, they kind of look like animals. Right? You take a cross-section of a human cell and a cross-section of a human body and an animal, it's not so different. And yet, there's something different. There's something qualitatively different. What is that? What makes a human human? Now, if we were medieval scholars in, let's say, the 12th century, we would think of this as a theological question. In the 16th century, this would be a philosophical question. I think today, it might be a neurochemical question. We put diodes on the head and we say like this human consciousness, where is it? Can we measure it? Is it a chemical process? Is it something else? Every society asks this question. My view is that Chazal also asked this question, but it takes the garb of this halachic debate about where do we measure the body from. So I said that like the face of the Mishnah is, how do we measure this man or this human? And the Gemara says it's really, how do we take measure of humanness? And that what Chazal do is that the language of halacha is at least part of the way they talk about that. Now, why does this have to do with Egla Rufa? Because Egla Rufa gets kicked off if you find a dead, a murdered body by the side of the road. Now, when you drive down and, a small animal, let's say a fly, you won't even see. A mouse, you probably won't even see. As the animal gets bigger, your main question will be to swerve it and not damage your car. But if you were to see a human body, I would hope that you would stop, you would call the authorities, and you'd investigate. Wait a minute, how did this happen? That, of course, begs the question as to sort of why these things are different. And that is the machlokas. And that's what the Gemara's move is, to read that Mishnah. So there, to me, is an example of something that is taking in one sense, a very narrow, almost hyperbolic, sort of almost a parody of legalism about really the head, the body, the nose, and saying, yeah, but here's what this is really about. Here's how we're going to invest that. Here's how we understand the stakes of that Mishnah. And seen that way, if we could call it a legal question, but then we're going to have to bend and expand what we mean by law. I would call it a halachic question, understanding the halacha includes these sorts of questions. I think this helps explain why, for Chazal, Talmud Torah is so important. Because those questions that are standing berumo shel olam, right, that the world does turn on in the deep sense, are the things that, at least in sometimes when we're learning, we're supposed to get out of it. Now, I can't tell you that every single line in every single Gemara is sort of this type of idea. I start with an extreme example, which I think it is somewhat unusual, but I think it makes the point, and then you could see some different scales in different other places.
So, but just to push that a little further, so one of the aspects of it being phrased in the language of law is that, I think what you're getting at is that what appears to be a debate about something highly technical about how the law should be applied in a given case, a very, very specific case. You generalize it out and you say, no, this is a much deeper conversation about something that is actually hard to come to a conclusion on. And there's a tension there because from to the extent that it's law as regulation, there must be a conclusion. And to the extent that it's law as Torah, there may be no conclusion, and elu ve'elu, and these are just hard questions that need to be argued out forever. So in this case, or in any case, there is a psak to some extent on the technical level. What are we to make of that? Does that tell us that there is an answer, so to speak, on the harder background question?
So that's a really, really good question. And I agree with your framing. In other words, like you said, law is a confining discourse, right? In other words, the point of law is to limit options and to limit possibilities and to arrive at some normative consensus for a community. If my argument is that this is something like literature or philosophy, so those discourses work precisely because, like you said, they don't lend themselves to conclusions, or they allow, the word you might want to use is like a cultural text. In other words, some anchoring device that lots and lots of different people, lots of different groups in society can find themselves in. So I think you hit it right on the head. To me, the fascination and the challenge of this system is that what, let's say in America, we assign to two totally different discourses with different rules, and we try to keep them separate. That the domain of law, precisely because it's coercive, it's by the state, and it needs a conclusion, we try to keep that relatively limited and with strong senses of what is law and what is not. By contrast, literature, philosophy, art, drama, music, any one of these things, or ways that cultures sort of express and form themselves, we don't tie them to the coercive mechanism of the state, and we're happy for them to merge and mix and flesh from one, kind of move from one to the other. I think you hit it on the head. The challenge and the fascination of halacha is that Chazal use the same group of texts and ideas for both of these purposes, though they could be opposite from each other. This leads to some amazing, I think, you could call it advantages or phenomenon, and it also has some dangers. So there's a great secular kind of analog, I think, to this that kind of makes the point. So about like 2004, 2005, Justice Antonin Scalia was on a panel at the Juilliard School with a bunch, he was a known opera lover. And he was on a panel at the Juilliard School with a bunch of, cultural cognoscenti and producers. Opera singer, I think Stephen Sondheim was there, and from the world of art and music, which, culturally and politically was not his world at all. And he made the point that he said, the role of a lawyer is exactly opposite of what you do. He says, what you do works because there's irony, because there's ambiguity, because there's layeredness, because there's texturedness in your work. And that's what makes it good. And then he says, the job of a lawyer is to take the drama, the humor, the irony out of everything he touches. Now, you can argue with Scalia on American law grounds. You could argue with him certainly on halachic grounds. But I think that's a good intuition in that there's a way in which, right, when we think of law in the modern sense, we think of that those features are bad, right, or at least complicated. Whereas my argument is, no, those are sort of enmeshed and morphed in halacha, and you can't take them. I mean, you could try to take them out, but then you're going to lose a whole lot of it. And that's to me like the central kind of tension and instigating interest that flows through the whole system is exactly what you said. That it tries to do things that the Alma in our world we keep separate and we think belong in different boxes. And we put them all together. So let me just give an example real quick. So it's sort of riffing on something in the book. So suppose that someone today is very bothered by the plight of, let's say, farm workers in the fields. So you can imagine a bunch of different responses, right? You think they're being mistreated, they're not paid enough, there's wage theft, their immigration, whatever it is. So you could go and you could propose a law, right? But you could also write an op-ed. You could write a novel highlighting this. You can make a movie or a documentary. You could, maybe someone would make a sculpture or even, a musical piece, right? And these would all be coming from the same place to call attention to this. But they'd be different mediums. And then we know that the law is the one that goes with the state and goes with the coercive mechanism and goes with that. And these other things they exist at the cultural level. Now, I think you could look at the opening sugya in the 7th parak above Mitzvah, and I think Chazal are bothered by some version of this, but they create a Mishnah that does both of these things all at once. And then as you go through the halach and the poskim, you see that they're constantly going back and forth between what here is sort of speaking to the lawyer, so to speak, to the dayan, to the judge, and what here is speaking to the moral conscience of the student of Torah who's supposed to understand. These are Bnei Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. We have to, so one shita, just to flesh it out, one shita in the Mishnah is that afilu natan lehem suda keshlomo hamelech beshato. In other words, even if the guy provides them food greater than the meal of Shlomo at the height of his power, lo yatzei nechavaso shehem Bnei Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Now, you don't need to be an economist to understand that's not the employment law. It makes no sense. Couldn't happen. That's in there to say, listen, understand who you're dealing with. Understand at the moral level. But it's mixed in the way it's all one unit, right? And that to me, that's like the op-ed or that's like the documentary, but it's mixed into the statute. And that's sort of a feature of it. And therefore that creates both great possibilities and some complexities.
So let's just move also a little bit closer to the future, and then we'll get all the way to the present. But as we move closer to the future, so certainly in the days of the Mishnah and the Gemara, that was true, that you have this very intense mixing of the language of law being used for all purposes, right? For getting across that range of ideas that you're talking about. As you start to move on later, certainly, from the time of the Rishonim and onward, as codification becomes a bigger part of our halachic system, and also the willingness to write treatises on topics starts to show up at a similar time, right? So now you can have the Rambam tell you, this is Mishnah Torah, a list for the most part of rules, though anyways we could talk about whether that's the right way to think about it, but for the most part a set of rules. And then you could have more Nevuchim, which doesn't tell you any rules. It just tells you how to think about things and onward, right? And even more so into our time where you could get a different book that tells you a highly specific set of rules about every topic and fill your whole library with it, right? So has that been lost, or is the same concept applicable today or even in a more modern set of texts?
So that's a great observation and question. So let's start with, surely you are right that, let's say from the era of the Rishonim and certainly from the era of the Shulchan Aruch, there has been a process of codification that has to some degree tried to disaggregate basically, the Gemara, right? This already starts in the days of the Gonim, in the, shortly after, some period after the Gemara is completed, to say, let's boil the Gemara down to its rules, and let's pull out those rules, right? And then leave the rest of it sort of there, and to try to rulify the halacha or to lawify the halacha. So I think that as a observation of the trend of, let's say, the last 1,000 years, there's certainly that is going on. I think your point about the Rambam is very astute in the following sense. The Baalei HaTosfos, so you can think of the Rambam's rough contemporaries and to some degree competitors, they didn't do either of those things. In other words, they did not try to abstract the Gemara into a book of rules. And I kind of feel that therefore they also didn't need to create separate works of philosophy. In other words, they continue in a slightly different register, but they continue the process of the Gemara itself. And to me, it's interesting that the Rambam and that school that really tries to sort of break out the rules of halacha, therefore do create separate books. But you're certainly right that move happens. I don't think it's quite as total as you suggest. And let me give a couple of counter examples. So if one, and I'd say it as follows, because the idea of Talmud Torah, to anyone who's a serious halachist, even the most rule-based halachic, the idea of Talmud Torah is always in the background. And as you read halachic literature, you see that it itself is sometimes torn between, are we here to tell you the rules, or are we here to discuss and analyze the sugya as it appears in the Gemara? So the Shulchan Aruch, even think about how we use that word. If we mean by the Shulchan Aruch the words of Rav Yosef Karo, the Mechaber, and maybe if you want to add in the words of the Ramav or of Moshe Isserles, yeah, those are pretty much about the rules. But as soon as you think of the Shulchan Aruch as the Shach and the Taz and the Ksos and that book, that massive set of tomes that we call the Shulchan Aruch, we might think of it like the expanded Shulchan Aruch, it's got a lot of stuff in there that is much more along these other sorts of lines, that is bringing that in, that is constantly not allowing that clean and neat division. We could take it a step further. And again, the tradition of the yeshivas of Lithuania, which, most yeshivas today in one form or another descend from, though they didn't pay much attention to Agadah, in their own language, they were enormously interested in these sort of meta-conceptual questions. So for example, Ravel Soloveitchik's, the Grizz, his first siman on Nizikin is basically what every torts professor does in the first day of class, which is, what is the difference between, he talks about in terms of Isser and Mammon, but really it's about what is the difference between a crime and a tort, a civil wrong and a criminal wrong. So I think that though it's true, and we can talk about this, that the agadic element does get recessed and separated out, there's always a strand of halachic thinking that is asking in the halachic language these sorts of questions, right? Rav Shimon Shkup, another one of the well-known achronim, is fascinating questions of what defines ownership, what defines property, what defines rights, what are duties, the sorts of things that we talk about in law school all the time. It's a different language, right? It's a different way of doing it, but it's pretty clear that those questions are foremost on his mind. If we talk about poskim, right? So the example I like is, these tshuvos about whether a golan counts for a minyan, right? It's asking, well, what is a person, right? It's another way of asking this question. So I think it's true that there's definitely a kind of narrowing and a sort of inward lookingness, but I think it's never quite as extreme, even on the page of the Shulchan Aruch, and certainly when you look at the rabbinic literature more broadly. I think in the past 50 years, but maybe really the past 30, there's been a greater attention to, reconnecting the halachic and the agadic elements. So the example I gave, as I said, though it is unambiguously halachic, the reading I gave to it is agadic. And people today, I think, are more attuned to, well, why is this agadita seemingly randomly thrown in here? Does it have anything to do with the halachic discussion that comes right before and right after? I think people are reading this in very, very interesting ways that to me are quite compelling and bringing us back. So it's true that, there was a move around the Shulchan Aruch and that became the platform for learning, but certainly really already for 200 years, there's been a pushback sort of to the Gemara itself, to the original sources, to the Mishnayos, to the Toseftas, to the Brises, and everything that follows, which is always bringing this dimension in. I tell my students that, printing the Ksot HaChoshen on the bottom of the Shulchan Aruch, it's as if you would take the US Code and put a bunch of law review articles there. on the bottom. Like it makes no sense in a certain system. But in this system, it does make sense, even though most of his interests are not how should you behave now, but like what is the nature of this idea? What is the nature of this concept?
Okay, we could talk about this all night. I am mindful of the time. A lot of our conversation has been kind of up here in the meta level about what is halacha and how does it work. Why don't we bring it down to some of your more recent work that has to do with very practical issues. And some of them have to do with these weird times during the pandemic that we're living in. I know you wrote an interesting article that had to do with Zoom seders in particular as a nice example that maybe will draw on some of these same concepts of just how, when the poskim are dealing with hard issues, are they balancing black letter law and deeper concepts about what's important to come to a ruling. So maybe let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So what I've become interested in, I would say more recently after the book, because remember, from when you finish writing it to when it's published is like 2 years. So the publication is like not so long ago, but is sort of like, how does something become halacha, right? So in the book, I talk about halacha, and I deal largely with sources that, by anyone's account are halachic. But how does something become halacha? So I think about it like this, like if I say or write something, right, I think the most accurate way to say it is Chaim Saiman, a professor of Jewish law, says X. No one would say that's halacha, right? If Rabbi Top says something, they would probably say something like Rabbi Top paskins or Rabbi Top holds, right? Now we go back a little further. When the Mishnah Berurah says something, now we don't say it's the Chafetz Chaim's opinion, although that's what it is. But we might say that's the halacha. And certainly when Rabbi Yosef Karo or Rabbi Moshe Isserles says something, it's almost the person becomes merged. We say the Shulchan Aruch, right? So what is that? I get very interested. Like, what is that process of how? Because every sif in the Shulchan Aruch at one point in time was Rabbi Yosef Karo sitting there with his quill and his paper, his parchment, whatever, and writing something, right? And then over time, it became the halacha. Or you can think of all sorts of borderline cases. It's like, I was just looking at something, the OU issued a document about, I was learning something about, tuna fish. Is that halacha? Or is that like the OU, right? Or now in COVID times, right? The OU and the RCA issued a bunch of guidance about how to do Yamim Noraim, and is that halacha? Or is that like, so this is like a fascinating process that is much more a social process of how we kind of bring these things in and conceptualize them, and when do they sort of become part of this halacha. And what I started to notice is that what it really is the reception, how people treat it, right? That everything written, right? Moshe wrote Mipia Gvura, but after him, right, certainly after the Gemara, to keep it simple, was written by a person who we know who it was, who I think at the moment of writing it was not canonized as halacha. And then it becomes that way. And then you think about, okay, so what are the communal formats that do that, right? So a little matter of who. I think things in Hebrew and Rabbinic Hebrew tend to be better off than things in English or Ladino or whatever it was. I joke that writing in 2 columns in Rashi script is more impressive than writing with punctuation and footnotes. But now we have journals and articles, things that have a very different form, and I think people start calling them halacha. So that's sort of been and then like how does that happen, right? And I think it's largely about people responding to things in certain ways and in ways that sort of conform to their understanding of what halacha is and what it could be and what it should be. And that halachic authorities are created by the community accepting them. What's been interesting in COVID times is because you're watching, I think COVID is like a pressure cooker. In other words, things that might take years or decades or maybe even centuries are now like sort of compressed within months, right? So that 2 weeks in COVID time is like 3 or 5, it's like 20 years in ordinary time. It's been fascinating to watch how certain rabbis have sort of stepped up and sort of, again, they're not coming out of nowhere, but like have sort of like defined a reputation as being a posek. And because people are like responding to these positively, they sort of become the halacha. Now, sometimes there's a lot of, that here's where like the kind of communal intuition and the formal intuition, sometimes are at war with each other, and sometimes one becomes the other. So an example, right? So if we were to think, if we're, because people now are talking about how do we keep Yom Noraim davening, let's take Rosh Hashanah, to its bare minimum, right? Because you're worried about time, about COVID, or whatever it is. So halachically, the answer here is not so complicated. The core of Musaf is the Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. Those are in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, and those are halachically required. All the piyutim are added later and optional. Not only that, there was a period where people objected to them because you're making a hefsek during Chazar Hashatz. So if I say, from a strictly halachic perspective, it is clear that you would not say Unisana Tokef, right? And all the parts of Shofaris that we mumble, those are really important. But from the way Judaism has been lived, right, that's crazy, right? Unisana Tokef is the heart of Musaf, even though halachically it's really not. It's almost expendable. I don't want to say that, but really. Now, but here's how the two mix. So I know I was privy to conversations where people said, maybe we should not say Unisana Tokef if we're looking to shorten the Musaf. And people went crazy. Rabbi, what are you talking about? Like, what religion do you practice? Now, the rabbi was right halachically, but wrong socially. And then the rabbi understood this himself and therefore said, no. And now you can imagine that if in 50 years or 100 years, they might be another thing, another reason that we need to shorten Musaf. They'll say, no. Unisana Tokef, that was paskin to be part of an integral part of the davening, because they wouldn't skip it. So you can watch here how this sort of social intuition then gets like packaged as a sort of minhag or sort of a quasi-halachic thing. And then the next time, that's already not expendable. As Rav Schechter wrote, the Chol Ma'aminim, he says, is one of the oldest piyutim, and you can't skip that one. And now you can imagine that like the exact same, that we're watching it happen, that Unisana Tokef is now being canonized because we'll skip this and we'll skip this and we'll do this. No one's changing that. So that to me is like an example of like watching something in real time simply become halacha, and at some point it'll be written up in some book in Rashi script, and then it'll be cited to, and then it'll become the halacha. So that's sort of one example that I've been watching of where you see like the formal and the social, but then they kind of merge into each other because we have a way of then taking those social intuitions, wrapping them up in halachic language, and then the next time they're already halacha as opposed to like just what people do.
Super interesting. Yeah, it almost that force from below of the community and its impact is super interesting. Not something I don't think that, well, it very rarely mentioned. Maybe like the concept of pukhazi or something like that, but very, very rarely mentioned in a halachic language of it mattering what the people do or don't do.
Right. So sometimes you're right, pukhazi is mentioned expressly, but usually what happens is it then shows up in a more formal source. But if you know
you should probably define that. I should have defined what that is. Do you want to?
Go ahead.
Oh, just every once in a while, the Gemara will say, go out into the shuk and see what is common practice. And by seeing what the people of the shuk are doing, that's relevant for determining what the ruling should be in that case.
Right. So sometimes it's done that directly. I think oftentimes it colors and flavors how the halachic categories are articulated. I'll give another example, maybe from something I wrote a couple months ago, earlier in the COVID saga, when with the whole Zoom Seder controversy. So what I was fascinated by was this: is that certainly around Pesach there were many psukim that were being issued, generally coolest and innovating and figuring out how we're going to do Pesach in COVID. And most of these, I would say, interested the types of people who read rabbinic listservs and rabbinic blogs, i.e., those people. I'm sure the rabbi was on it and interested in maybe some others. But like they didn't break the plane. And then there was this group of rabbis of Moroccan extraction in Israel that issued the famous Zoom Sock. And within 3 days, within an hour, it was all over the Israeli and English language Jewish press. Within a day, it was all over the secular Israeli and American press. Within 2 days, it was already reported in Jakarta and in Indonesia and in the French papers, the French, secular papers. And what fascinated me was, wait, why this? What happened here? Why is this interesting, everybody? And then, a week later, there was already an Israeli sketch comedy scene about it from like Zehuze, one of like some Saturday Night Live, Israeli, version of Saturday Night Live. And this fascinated me because as soon as I saw that psak, without doing an ounce of halachic research, I was like, no way. And my intuition was right in the sense of everyone understood this one is different. And I was really interested in, wait, how does everybody know this one's different? How does Haaretz, right? Not a paper known for its halachic erudition, or the French paper, how do they know this is different? And that's kind of the question I asked myself when I set out to write. And my argument is, people know that electricity, particularly the internet and Shabbos, is something deeper. Now, halachically, from a strictly Hilchos Yontif Shabbos perspective, the Moroccan rabbis were arguably right. Certainly on Yontif, the whole question of electricity on Shabbos is complicated, but on Yontif it's simpler. And there is ample room to say this is not a problem, or at least not a huge problem that can't be overcome by countervailing considerations. But socially, and I think this is what everyone understood from the sketch comics to the rabbis, is that you introduce the computer and the internet and all that represents to Yontif, you're gonna kill Yontif and you're gonna kill Shabbos. I don't care if it's technically allowed. And I think everyone understood that, and that's why it attained this sort of fame. And then what you see is that the various Rabbanim who responded sort of took those intuitions and then built them into halachic arguments. And I think but sometimes they said it directly. So Rav Asher Weiss, a posek, I think, not that he needs my haskama at all, but I think the world of, he's in Israel, he basically said, it's like ki'ilu yatsa bat kol, as if like a heavenly voice came and declared electricity is asur on Shabbos. Yes, I understand that technically it's complicated and there's lots of reasons why you could say yes and why you could say no, but this is what people, and he says, look what people do. Everyone understands that you're going to kill Shabbos if you allow this, and therefore they did. So that to me is an example of where yes, it gets framed in some sense in halachic terms, but what's leading and pushing this is a sort of social understanding of what Shabbos is supposed to look like, what the internet and the online world represents, which is today, to maybe circle back to the very beginning, these are our 39 melachos, right? If you ask your kids, what does Shabbos mean? They're not going to tell you sewing. They're not going to tell you, they're going to say no phones. That's what Shabbos is. No phones. And that intuition is a strong one. And I think that's what the pushback to the Zoom Seder is, that people understood that today, just like in the days of the Mishnah, Shabbos was the cessation of your work, which was sewing and plowing and all that kind of stuff. Today, it's a cessation of our work, which is no phones.
I love it. Okay, great. Well, we've been going for an hour. I'm mindful of the time. That's actually a great way to finish up. And it's just a beautiful example of how your teaching pushes us to learn the detail, to understand it and be grounded in it, and also to be able to step back and take away the deeper lessons from all of it. And so we should be inspired to do both. And hopefully this was a first start. So thank you. Really appreciate you joining all of us.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully we'll join us
I'm
again
happy
soon.
to stick around for a few minutes for questions. It is 12, but I'm happy to stick around.
I don't know. Zoom doesn't feel like work. Zoom feels like we could do Talmud Torah just like we just did for the last hour. feels pretty Shabbos-tic to me.
I don't know.
I am. If it was only used for Torah.
If it was only used for Torah, that's right. You know, people talk about, I think this is like a sort of another example, right? So davening, you know, now every phone has a sitter app, right? I don't say I don't do it, but I think it's just a bad idea because it's too hard not to get distracted.
You know what? The sitter app, right, won't let you daven on Shabbat. I live in Hong Kong, in Israel, and all around the world. So it's a bit, it hasn't figured it out that you're not in New York or Yerushalayim, right? So like it won't let you daven Mariv when it thinks it's Mariv and it's Shabbat, right? So it's very smart. But the next step was to then the sitter app, one of the sitter apps now turn off your other notifications.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're davening, you don't get your WhatsApp messages.
That's right. Seems like a good idea.
All right. The nice part about it is if you in the COVID days when you're not davening with a minyan, it's hard to forget Rosh Chodesh or anything else when you daven with the sitter app.
Oh, I'm not an anti-technology person. I think but I do think that, again, forget it's not my opinion. My sense is that the reason this excited so many people and so many different types of people, and that the reaction from, you know, the Haredi right to even the, you know, the like halachically egalitarian left was on to say, bad idea to have a Zoom Seder, is because there's like deep understanding of Shabbos and the potential impact of these technologies on it, even if at the technical level you can find a way through it. By contrast, I just say when you know, for things like in hospitals or, you know, anytime there's like some need, I think people will rely on these, but they want to keep that as a sort of marginalized exception rather than the rule. I'd also say something I thought was also fascinating was that there's like a relative aspect to this, in the following sense. When the poskim or the rabbis dealt with, well, what about the people who are going to be stuck for 3 days and the danger, you know, elderly people, whatever, because it was a 3-day yontif. So they said, use the phone. And I thought this is fascinating. 40 years ago, the phone was the thing that represented that connectivity. And I can't imagine they would have said that. But today, the phone, literally like the landline, has been eclipsed by, you know, the Zoom and the internet and all this. It's like it's like already like a little safer. So I think there's even like a relative aspect to this about like what we see and, you know, feel is the sort of thing that will threaten the structure of Shabbos. That's a little speculative, but I found that very interesting when they said, yeah, call them on a landline. That's okay. Even though, like, really, what's the difference between the landline and the Zoom? And the answer is technically, probably not much, but experientially, a lot.
Hey, Chaim, I do have a question.
Hi.
Hi.
So we have another Atlanta connection here.
Since women don't typically learn Gemara, are we missing out on these other lessons that you suggest come out of the learning? Do we have another mechanism for getting that element?
So that's a good question. So I would suggest that women should learn. And as you know, there's definitely been a move, at least within our communities over the last 50 years or so, for that. So that would be like my view. I do think that if one doesn't have access to this side, I think that you're missing. I think Chazal thought you were missing. Now, why Chazal then pottered or maybe even prohibited women from learning Torah, you know, that's its own question. But I certainly think that in an era where this is, at least in our community, is accepted and encouraged and fostered, one should take advantage of that.
Sounds good. Thanks.
So Aviva and I grew up in, and we're in the same class in elementary school, and until I left to Ner Yisrael for high school.
Did they really leave?
This
is Adir Posey. I've just been lurking in the background. We're getting to 9:05, and even later in the East Coast. So I just wanted to say thank you and how much we've appreciated. Sorry that it's been in and out. I don't know if you can see all the different people there, but we'll just spotlight you briefly just to say again how much we appreciate all the chance to be able to really broaden our perspective and broaden our minds through this conversation. And also a special thank you to Josh Katzen, who both, just to give a sense of the background, has really been part of helping us creatively think about a variety of different speakers to bring, and then went above and beyond to be able to help facilitate this conversation. So just on behalf of Beth Jacob, I want to say thank you again for a really enlightening and wonderful chance to learn together, and looking forward to continuing opportunities, hopefully very soon in person.
Okay, that'd be great.
that
Thank you.
we hope to be able to spend time and gain from and learn together.
Thank you so much. Laila Tov and Shana Tova to everybody.